Radisys, as you know, provides enabling technologies. We do a lot of system integration work. And a lot of folks in this room are our customers, friends, people that we are interacting with anyways. So really would like to make the session interactive as well. Uh, we hear a lot of talk about 5G. Obviously, we hear a lot of talk about at ONF. Also, we're talking about SIBA, and Oz has really set the stage up for me, so I don't have to go deep into what Commack is, but bring in a perspective of how the intersect is happening between ORAN. Anybody who's not heard of ORAN? uh, we'll talk about ORAN. We'll talk about TIP, and then obviously ONF, and how these three sort of streams are all converging. So just with that, my ubiquitous marketing slide that my guys always tell me to put up, but it's interesting because we see SD-PON is a Radisys coined term. It's software-defined PON. Radisys has been involved with ONF from the start. We've been from the RCOR days, then SIBA. And it's mainly about, we are looking at PON also becoming increasingly a option for transport in this whole ODTN network site. PON is becoming the economics of PON that are coming in, and how does that converge? And Oz also hinted at it from a Commack perspective. How is this sort of all converging? Obviously, 5G access. We'll talk about everything from the RU, DU, CU. By the time we leave this room, you guys will know everything about RU, DU, CU. And really, these two words, disaggregation and ecosystem. What we are really seeing today is disaggregation is becoming a technology, right? Disaggregation is about an ecosystem. If you look at, what ORAN is doing at standardizing the 7.2x, which is basically the split between your RU going into your DU, the front haul. And that's not just technology, it is an ecosystem. It now really brings in the true multi-vendors. Multi-vendors are great, but a lot of you will attest, especially folks who are from service providers, that multi-vendors is a great term, but a really painful term if you have to manage different boxes. And somebody has to obviously step up and say, how do we bring all these boxes together? Who's going to take on that ownership so that a multi-vendor ecosystem still can look like what we're used to from the bigger vendors. So we're not trying to go back into black box, but you need an integrator who will step up and say, okay, I can bring all these different components together. I think all of us have struggled in labs when we're trying to put different components together, and what the data sheet says and what the reality is very different sometimes. So let's look at this diagram. I mean, I think everybody knows this, but a couple of interesting highlights here. One is this thing with MEC or MAEC or intelligent edge, whatever be the word that people like to use, and then the RAN intelligent controller, RIC. How it is coming in, where it's going to be co-located, is it going to be a separate box, is it a logical function? I think that there are a lot of open questions up there. There's a lot of healthy debate going on within ORAN Alliance as well in the different working groups about, where will RIC fit in, and how does that then fit in along with MEC or the multi-access edge. BBU and then containerization of the BBU, and then that containerization flowing down, or the cloudification nowadays. We have an opinion about it, and I think it's only an opinion. There are different ways of doing and slicing and dicing this. And then network slicing, how does that fit in? We'll talk about a few of those sort of concepts in there. But the model here is that when we talk about open is open APIs, open interfaces, almost specifications that are open in terms of driving an open architecture. So open is not only about just open source, it's not about some repository or some GitHub hosting some code and then who's going to manage it, right? I think open means a lot more than just open source. And as Radisys, our view is that open interfaces will really help drive the adoption of these networks. So this next gen network really depends on the openness in terms of the interfaces, standard open interfaces, open architectures, and a vibrant community of multi-vendors that can actually build products in compliance with this, and then the interop validation test so that these different products are actually working together. So where Radisys plays, and I don't have to go through this chart, this is just there, you guys can look at it, but we pretty much are in almost all standardization bodies, all standardization forums. We do want to and are taking an active role. If you look at, obviously our, the holy grail, so to say, for us is 3GPP, and then all the offshoots around it. If you look at TIP, and we'll talk about TIP, obviously ONF, ORAN Alliance, we were there initially from the XRAN days, and then its evolution to ORAN Alliance. Small Cell Forum, did a lot of work in FAPI. Even today, we actually are contributing and are the specs for NFAPI. And then CBS Alliance, there's a big ribbon cutting thing happening next Wednesday. The iPhone announced support for Band 48. Lots of things going on in the CBS Alliance world. We are in there. In fact, we are the ones who are the engine for the OnGo certification platform as well. So we spoke a lot about ORAN. Most of you guys have seen this diagram. What really I was talking about is the NGFI, which is now called the Open Front Hall Interface, OFH, which is basically our 7.2x. So the 3GPP split was a 7.2b. There are some changes within ORAN that have now, the spec is out there, the 7.2x. We firmly believe that this leads to the softwareization and the multi-vendor ecosystem around the radio units, the RUs, and then getting into the DUs or the distributed units. So in the classical world, all of this was one sort of big black box, and hence trying to show a big black box in the back, but we want to start cutting it. And as you go up the stack, I always call it like, you have your feet, which was your open front hall, and then the brain, which is now the RIC, the RAN Intelligent Controller. In the good old world, that's where all your SON, RRM, a lot of those functions reside. Lots of things going on there, well announced, well documented. There's an implementation of RIC by AT&T and Nokia. Containerized, people are contributing to it. Radisys is contributing to it. The E2 interface, I think there are demos that I just walked by and I saw that there are demos on, people are talking about E2 here as well. So this is happening. F1, well-defined interface. E1, which separates your CUUP and CUCP. Oz was talking about separating out the control plane, the cups. Open APIs. E1 interface helps you connect your CUUP and your CUCP, user plane and control plane for the central unit. And then as you go up, you have the real-time RIC and the non-real-time RIC. You're getting into the OSS, BSS world as you get up, further up and up. Focusing on the real-time RIC, that's where a lot of the AI, ML, and we'll talk about that. A lot of activity going on. So that's, you want to have different workloads, and how are you going to now bring in the AI, ML algorithms in there? So Radisys today, we play in all these different working groups, but we are actually the co-chair, the vendor co-chair for work group 8 that is building a reference stack diagram or a reference stack architecture for this. And as part of, ORAN has now teamed up with Linux Foundation. And in December, there will be a release of the DU source code contributed by Radisys. Today, there are specs out there for what's called the ORAN DU, the ODU, and the OCU, and the ORU. ORAN RU, ORAN DU, ORAN CU. Again, we are the lead there from that spec perspective, working with the large ecosystem of community of developers and different companies. We are also in TIFG, which is the Test Integration Focus Group. TIFG is really critical because this group is newly formed. It was announced at ORAN Japan, in the meeting in Japan, and then eventually formalized at MWC Shanghai. You'll hear more about it in MWCLA and the ORAN meeting that's going to happen in Costa Rica just prior to that. But TIFG essentially is going to be the harmonized sort of set of specs to take the end-to-end testing. Each working group will have their own specs. So each working group, meaning that, for example, work group 4 focuses on the open fronthaul interface, and they're going to have their list of specs for testing and validation of the open fronthaul interface. TIFG will look at it from an end-to-end perspective. So it'll obviously adopt whatever the individual work groups are doing, but then also overlay it with an end-to-end spec. So let's move to TIP. Again, lots of programs in TIP. This is more on the mobile track, so I kept it towards the mobility side. Radisys, again, was involved with TIP from day one. Open Cellular, that's a, believe it or not, 2G base station. We were involved in that. We got into unbundled access, which was LTE or 4G focused. And this was sort of, I would call the initial starting point of this disaggregation. So as part of that, there was a V1 spec that's now adopted by 3GPP called W1, which basically separates out your BBU and your RRH in an LTE world. In the 5G world, that becomes your F1 between your CU and your DU, or the mid-haul. Virtual RAN, it focused on non-ideal backhaul, remnants of the starting points for OFH. So here, lots of innovative companies were doing a lot of work there using Ethernet, ROE, as a transport mechanism. OpenRAN 4G, driven by Vodafone and Telefonica. Radisys has been involved in this. In fact, we were awarded the best 4G software based on the findings that Vodafone and Telefonica did at the last TIP summit. Right now, there are deployments going on. Lots of folks, the Mavenairs, Parallel Wirelesses of the world, openly announced they are actually deploying there. And they are our customers. And then OpenRAN 5G is a new program within TIP. This is led by Sprint and by Vodafone. They are the two operator co-chairs for this program for OpenRAN 5G. The beauty is that OpenRAN 5G is adopting the 7.2x split that ORAN Alliance has said. So we are now starting to see convergence where there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. They're saying, yes, we like what ORAN is doing. We're going to adopt that. And that's part of the spec that Sprint has put out there within OpenRAN 5G. So let's go to Commack. I shamelessly borrowed these diagrams from the web because no reason to reinvent them. And I won't focus on the interior. I think that we spent a good solid 40 minutes and Oz went through that in detail. But if you look at the ORAN controller, this now has shades of RIC. So that's where we are trying to merge or converge between the activities that ORAN is doing and what ONF through Commack is doing. We have OMEC, that is for the EPC. So there we have multiple sources of open source EPC. There's a contribution from Sprint and Intel as one of the contributions for EPC there. Obviously the fabric, trellis, SDN, we spoke about all of that. What I would like to focus on additionally is when we talk about CIBA, Volta, and PON, there is co-DBA, cooperative DBA. So when you want to bring an optical transport network, now you're having, say, your RUs, and before they go on to the DU, you'll have a transport network on the front haul, then you have something in the mid haul and the back haul. There you have your transport network elements. That's where you can now start co-locating your OLT, virtual OLT, and your DU. Now, there's a lot of magic that has to happen. One of the most important things is scheduling. CoDBA actually talks about how do you now bring in common scheduling for your PON, for your virtual OLT, and for your DU. So how do you use the frames that are available for the DU to transmit, and when they're not, then the PON does it, the OLT does it. So it's a nice spec out there on CoDBA. This is something that I would encourage, and that comes in, that starts making this a reality. We also want to talk about a common SDN infrastructure between the wireless side and the wireline side. And that's where the SDN, so ONOS being one instance of it, that's where that starts coming in. And I think maybe we didn't touch on this earlier, but OAM is so critical. We talk about open APIs, open interfaces, the Netcoff-Yang model. That's what a lot of the customers now are just adopting. And I think that that's another critical element that we have to talk about how do we manage all these different pieces together? So that's where Netcoff and Yang, I think, in my opinion, are definitely coming and becoming the de facto standard there. Kind of a busy slide. don't want to get into specific details, but 3 or 4 things that I think are really critical. I mean, we have spectrum. There is license spectrum. We've seen CBRS in the 4G world, and in release 16 and 5G, we'll get the NRU, the NR unlicensed. And then obviously, the reuse of the assets or the smart use of the existing spectrum, DSS being one of them, dynamic spectrum sharing. We have different options, different ways that these are being implemented. Verizon, for example, has made a lot of noise around DSS for obvious reasons. Then let's talk about, a hot topic about virtualization. I think there's a question previously about, is it VNFs or VMs, and then is it going to go to cloud? Our view of the world is that a lot of it today is VM based. Yes, now we're getting into this hybrid zone where there is VMs and CNF, Kubernetes. And eventually we see a world evolving which will go more towards containers. Now, the guys who are the container specialists or the container experts in this room, one of the things that's a burning question is security within containers. There are different approaches. That's something that we are looking at as well, because it's not, security becomes a critical element. So while we want to build in this IT infrastructure into telecom, how are we now going to now secure that? AI ML, this is actually borrowed from the work group 3. There's a lot of work in ORAN Alliance. Work group 3 is doing a lot of work around AI ML. So Radisys provides all of the yellow boxes. We have all of those pieces. But the critical part now becomes, how are we now going to onboard the different AI ML algorithms and the latency issues around it. And then the last is the front haul. This is on 7.2x. And also about when we bring in CoreDBA and mapping the requirements of latency and throughput. So there are some calculations out there, and we can look through those in detail. Happy to go through them. Sort of almost my last slide. So I like to call it like the, Radisys calls itself as the aggregator of the disaggregation. And what it really is that, in our opinion, service providers still philosophically want one neck to choke. How do we provide that one neck to choke? By doing the system integration functions as we build on a multi-vendor ecosystem. So the principles are there of white box disaggregation. The principles are there of bringing different component players. But how do we build all of this together? As I've spoken about open source, open source to us is open APIs, open architectures, open interfaces. That's very critical to us. It's very critical to the industry at large. And we can actually provide a sandbox. We have all the components. If someone wants to build a DU, a CU, a RU, we have all the components from a virtual OLT perspective. We're looking at, is it a physical function? Is it a VM? Is it a cloud native function? We're looking at different deployment scenarios. Which split makes the most sense? In certain cases, option 6 makes the most sense, FAPI based. In certain cases, a split architecture going with a split 7.2x and a split 2 makes the most sense. It all is defined and driven by what the deployment and the use cases are for the same. So if you look at it from an end-to-end perspective, from the left to the right, or right to the left rather, you have your AUs going into your DU, into a CU, into the EPC or the 5GC, depending on if it's NSA or SA. We've spoken a lot about this. The red boxes are the ones that we actually need to focus on. So that's where RIC comes in. That's where your MANO comes in. Is it ONAP? Is it going to be a different flavor doing MANO? Is it a common OAM? And then what are the Netcoff Yang models? Transport, we spoke about CoreDBA as one. So we call it X-haul, front haul, mid haul, back haul. Bringing in CoreDBA and the convergence from a Commack perspective of CIBA, aspirations of CIBA with the requirements that mobility comes in. and obviously security and cloudification, which always go hand in hand. And then aggregating all of this across, that's where a strong system integrator has to step in. And it's not only the aggregation, right? It's basically the LCM of it. And as we always say, right? I mean, open source is great as long as there's someone who's maintaining that open source, who's maintaining, taking those changes and ensuring that they are propagating in, that those are being added in. And LCM goes across the board. The work that we are going to do at the test integration focus group in TIFG and ORAN, that's one starting point of it. We're already seeing announcements with different service providers coming up with different labs for testing, validating, doing the interop for these different interfaces. That's it. Thank you.